Thank you very much, Bryson. And thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. And I also would like to let you know that I have been working with some wonderful, very experienced colleagues. So the research that you're going to hear tonight is not just my work, it's the work of a collaborative effort. John Johnson, Steve Schwartz, Renee Volanowith, and Glenn Ferris. So without further ado, let's see if we can get going. Oops, a little too fast. There. The story of the lone woman is so much more than just a story of one woman who was abandoned on San Nicolas Island for 18 years. Tonight, we're going to talk about the people who left that island in 1835. These were her people who were her family, her community, probably even very close family. So much of what has been written about them has come from secondary sources. And one thing we focused on was finding original sources with primary information, that is, eyewitness accounts or event participant accounts. Because as you can see, the lone woman's story and her people has pretty much been told through newspaper accounts from the 19th century, the 20th century, and so much of that information has been incorrect. There have been some kernels of truth, but a lot of it has been hearsay or secondary, passed on from person to person. And actually, I think before I go a little bit beyond this, just to make sure we're all on the same page, how many of you have read Island of the Blue Dolphins? Okay, a lot, but not everybody. Okay, then I should just do a little bit of basic background. Island of the Blue Dolphins was a children's novel written by Scott Odell, first published in 1960. It was based on the story of the lone woman of San Nicolas Island. She was also called the Lost Woman and, in some cases, the Wild Woman of San Nicolas Island. She was left alone from 1835 to 1853 when her people were removed from the island. She was unintentionally left behind. There are stories, and they may or may not be true, that she jumped off a boat. When all of her people were on the boat, she said she missed a son on the island, and we're actually doing some research to find out if this was in fact accurate and not just fantasy. But at this point, from what we know so far, she was left to live by herself for 18 years. Then a otter hunting group that was led by George Nidever from Santa Barbara came and found her on the island, picked her up, had her accompany them back to Santa Barbara. She lived about 7 weeks from the time she arrived in Santa Barbara and lived with a Nidever family. There's a thought that she likely contracted dysentery. She also fell off the porch of the Nidever adobe and hurt herself that way, but she declined quite rapidly about 7 weeks from the time that she was left on the or brought to Santa Barbara. So, but in that time that she was in Santa Barbara, there were attempts made to find people who could communicate with her. And some of those attempts were partially successful, but for the most part, her story and the story of her people, particularly the people taken to San Pedro, was not recorded. So what we tried to do is go back to the original records that were recorded at the time that the Nicoleños were taken from San Nicolas Island and brought to San Pedro. And we had these basic questions to answer. How many Nicoleños sailed from the island? And we know that they sailed on a schooner called the Peores Nada. Where were the Nicoleños taken after they arrived in San Pedro? And were any Nicoleños alive when the lone woman sailed to Santa Barbara in 1853? And you can see from the map here, there's a pretty straightforward route between San Pedro and San Nicolas Island. We're not sure if this is the exact route that the Peores Nada took, but it's likely that they went to pick up this group, the community living at the Tule Creek site on the northwest coast of the island. And we had two features that helped us to find and follow the Nicoleños. That was to look at original sources with primary information. By original sources, I mean copies of the originals or the original documents themselves, rather than relying on derivative information like transcripts or translations or indexes, because whenever humans transcribe a document, there is room for error. And it's not that original sources are free of error, but there's less error possible when you go to the original source. And the other part of that search strategy was to look for primary information, that is, information from event participants or eyewitnesses to events. So we looked at, particularly focused on Mexican records from Alta California from 1835 through 1850. And after that, we looked at United States documents, particularly census records, land records, probate, that sort of thing. We also looked at other material for context, which was very helpful because it's not just about the number of people and where they went, but who were they living with and how were they treated. We wanted to know all those things. The second feature that helped us to find and follow the Nicoleño was to use a genealogy research technique called the FAN principle. And basically, we're looking for the Nicoleños fan club. And I know that sounds odd, but FAN stands for friends, associates, and neighbors. And this helped us not only to understand the social and economic context in which the Nicoleños were living in Los Angeles at the time, but it helped us to harvest clues that allowed us to track the Nicoleño as they were moving through their new lives in Los Angeles. So fans were very important. And this document here is an example of how we used fan research. It's an 1836 initial page of the Indian section for the Mexican census of Los Angeles. And this census was fabulous because it told us in very detailed descriptions of where many of the Indians came from, Yuma or Yaqui, or in this case, in the highlighted square, there is one woman who is noted as Islena, and that means island Indian. We believe she is one of the Nicoleños, highly likely to be one of the Nicoleños who came from San Nicolas Island in 1835. What was frustrating about this census record was that the people who did the enumeration segregated the Indians from the other people in the city. So you couldn't tell from looking at the census record whether or not the Indians were living with and working for some of the other non-Indian people in the city. So what we had to do was to look at who Juana's neighbors were. And her immediate neighbor just above her was a young boy by the name of Ignacio, and he was a Yaqui Indian. And from primary and secondary records, we learned that Ignacio was from northern Mexico, from the Guaymas area. He had been captured by a Mexican soldier and was about to be shot. And his life was spared because James Johnson, who was an Englishman who was in Guaymas, saw what was about to happen. He offered the soldier $12 to buy this young boy. And the soldier agreed. So Ignacio got to join the family of James Johnson. James Johnson was known as Santiago Johnson in Alta California and in Mexico. And he came with the family to Los Angeles and lived with James Johnson's family and his relatives, the Guirados. That was his wife's mother's family. So we know from the association on the census record, and we also know because Juana's godmother was a Nieves Guirado, that she was living in the same household. So that's how fan club research helped us with this particular issue. Now, these two gentlemen were our primary source of information about the Peores Nada. We know that Isaac Sparks was the one of the gentlemen who was on the Peores Nada, the Mexican schooner that went to San Nicolas Island to pick up the Nicoleño and bring them to Los Angeles. We know that from a Mexican document that I'm going to show you in a moment. And George Nidever was a otter hunter. He was born in 1802 in Tennessee, came to Santa Barbara in the early 1830s, Isaac Sparks was born in 1803 in Maine, also came to the Los Angeles area initially and then lived in Santa Barbara. And they met up and they went otter hunting in December of 1835, January of 1836. And it was on this trip that Isaac Sparks told George Nidever about the fact that Isaac Sparks had taken the Peoris Nada to San Nicolas Island to pick up the Nicoleños and bring them to Los Angeles. So we don't have the information directly from Isaac Sparks, but he is noted on a Mexican document, and we learned this from George Nidever's oral history that was recorded by E.F. Murray in 1878. And this is the document. This is not an original. This is a copy from 1878 made by Thomas Savage for Hubert Howe Bancroft. This is from 1835, and this gave us a starting point from which to look for information on the Nicoleños in Los Angeles. This says that the Peoris Nada, they were getting ready to load aguardiente, which is a brandy, and angelica, which I believe is also an alcoholic beverage, onto the ship. They're sending it up to Monterey, and from Monterey they were going to send lumber up to San Francisco. And this was a note asking for permission to ship from the captain of the port. So this gives us a date and time from when to begin to look for information on the Nicoleños. And unfortunately, there's no passenger manifest. It doesn't say that the ship had been on San Nicolas Island, but this sure gives us an indication of the approximate date when the ship would have been out there and been back to San Pedro. And these two gentlemen definitely played a part in where the Nicoleños went when they came off the boat. James Johnson, who I mentioned before, had a lease understanding with the owners of Rancho San Pedro. So he was running horses and cattle on Rancho San Pedro, right down here by the water, between 1833 and 1840. And Isaac Williams was another American born 1799 in Pennsylvania, came to Los Angeles. He also knew Isaac Sparks and George Nidever from hunting trips. And both of these gentlemen appear to have worked together to distribute the Nicoleño in Los Angeles. They may have actually been in cahoots, if you know the old-time term. They may have secretly collaborated because they both benefited. One of them had a female Nicoleña come to live with him, Isaac Williams, and I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. And James Johnson, known as Santiago Johnson, he was connected with 4 different people who were godparents to Nicoleños. So he and his family definitely benefited from having the Nicoleños in their household. And basically, what they did with them is have them act as servants. So they had homes to go to, but they were expected to serve the families. And this is a scene here of San Pedro about 1875, and you can see Dead Man's Island in the background. There's been 2 primary source documents that we looked at before this time that had information about the Nicoleño, and that was about a middle-aged man who was very robust, and we learned this from both George Nidever and from William Dane Phelps, who was master and commander of the Alert. Phelps wrote in his diary of 1841 that there was a man who was partly foolish from San Nicolas Island from a hit on the head that he had with a fight with the Alaskan native otter hunters, but that he lived at San Pedro, and he helped. He would assist the hunters, assist the sailors by hauling in the ships and hauling in seals and helping them scrape the blubber off or whatever it is they do with the marine life there. Anyway, those were the only 2 accounts we'd had up until this point. There were eyewitness accounts about a gentleman by the name of Blackhawk, and of course that was not his name. That was name given to him by sailors who were on the ship Alert. And as it turned out, the best source of information initially, after we found the Mexican document, were Sacramento records from the Catholic Church. There had been rumors about the Nicoleños being taken to Mission San Gabriel. And it turns out that that was not the case. We looked very thoroughly at the records, the baptismal and death records at Mission San Gabriel, Mission San Fernando Rey, and the Los Angeles Plaza Church, which was part of the Catholic Church, obviously, in the Los Angeles area. There were no Nicoleño, no Isleño, no people from Isla, and that stands for Island Indian, showing up in records at Mission San Gabriel in 1835 or later. But there were Nicoleño and probable Nicoleños showing up in Los Angeles at the Los Angeles Plaza Church from 1835 through 1836. And one of the reasons why they weren't going to Mission San Gabriel is because the missions were going through secularization. They were being given over to civil administration. In fact, the Franciscan Padre, Tomas Esteban, left Mission San Gabriel without leave, and he was gone from Mission San Gabriel from July of 1835 through April of 1836. So it made no sense that they would have the Nicoleños go to Mission San Gabriel when there was no Franciscan Padre there. As it turns out, the very first person to be baptized was a young boy, and he was noted as being como de 5 años, so about 5 years old. His parents were noted as Gentiles or unbaptized Indians from San Nicolas Island. And he was baptized by a French Catholic priest who was at that time in charge of both Mission San Gabriel and the Los Angeles Plaza Church. This is Father Jean Augustus Alexis Bachelot, and he signed his name Alejo Bachelot when he was in Alta California. He himself had been in exile. He was kicked out of Hawaii. He had been sent to Hawaii to establish a Catholic mission there, and there was a squabble, and the Protestant missionaries convinced the Queen in Hawaii that it was dangerous to have a Catholic priest there, so she kicked him out. She sent him on a boat to San Pedro, and he and his compatriot Patrick Short were dumped off some uncharitably at the beach at San Pedro. So he was much like the Nicoleños. He was without a home and a place that he didn't belong. But he stayed in California. He assisted Father Sanchez and Father Estanaga at Mission San Gabriel. And when the need arose, he helped out at Los Angeles Plaza Church and helped to baptize little Tomas Guadalupe. By the way, the Franciscan priests and Father Bachelot were estimating the ages of the Nicoleños. They didn't know all the California Indian languages, so they just looked at the person and decided, oh, he's about 5, or oh, she's about 20. So the ages are kind of a general estimate. Tomas had a godmother who was very interesting, Adelaida Johnson, who was the 5-year-old daughter of James Johnson. So we found this very intriguing because we had never before seen a godmother who was 5 years old. She was the same age as Tomas. We still haven't figured that out, but it's true. We've checked her birth records. There's no question that she was very young. Maybe they wanted to teach her responsibility at a real early age. And the other person who we know, who is unquestionably Nicoleña, was baptized as Maria Magdalena, or Magdalena. She was baptized by Father Pedro Cabot because Father Bachelot was out of town at the time. And as you can see from her baptism record, she was only indicated as Isleña when she was baptized, not from San Nicolas Island, but because we check original records, we always make sure we're checking every original record we can get our hands on. We looked at the burial record, and it clearly states she is a neophyte de las Islas de San Nicolas. And of course, Islas was a mistake. It's the island of San Nicolas, not the islands of San Nicolas. And the burial was officiated by Father Alejo Bachelot. So thank goodness that Father Bachelot at least knew she was from San Nicolas Island. The other thing that's interesting about this is she was ill. She was noted as enferma, and she was not baptized in the church. She was baptized in the pueblo. And this made us very curious. Where was she? Who was she living with at the time? She was given, even though she was sick, she was given godparents Narciso Boteo and his wife Francisca Ruiz. They were cousins to James Johnson's wife. So more connections with the Johnson family. Johnson family made out very well. But she didn't show up in the 1836 census. She probably died before they did the census. So it took us a while, but we finally figured out where Maria Magdalena was living. And I will tell you about that in just a minute. Okay, so this shows you a summary of the people who we know are from San Nicolas Island: Tomas, Guadalupe, and Maria Magdalena, who I've just told you about. Juana, you've seen the first page of the Indian section of the 1836 census. She was listed as Isleña or de la Isla, but because of the timing of her baptism in 1836, because no other island Indians were being baptized from any of the other islands, from San Clemente Island or from Catalina Island, we believe it's highly likely that she was from San Nicolas Island as well. And little Maria Luciana was interesting. She was a newborn, but she was baptized and her parents were said to have been island Indians. Again, because of the timing of her baptism in 1836, it's possible that her parents also could have come off the boat from San Nicolas Island. It's also possible that they could have come from earlier from San Clemente Island or Santa Catalina Island and not been baptized, waited. They had a daughter, they wanted her baptized. So they're a little bit less likely, but it's still a strong possibility. And if they were Nicoleños, then she was conceived on San Nicolas Island. So she would have been Nicoleño had she not come over on the boat and been born in Los Angeles. And Maria Aleja is another one who we think is highly likely to be from San Nicolas Island. She was said to have been about 45 years old, and we do have a fairly reliable record. Well, we've got a primary source, the U.S. Census for 1850, noting a woman by the name of Maria in her godmother's household, in the household of Maria Ignacia Amador. We also have a newspaper account saying one of the middle-aged Nicoleñas lived in the household of a highly respectable citizen for most of her life while she was in Los Angeles. So we believe Maria Aleja is also highly likely to be a Nicoleña. And I love this photograph, by the way. This is 1880, Los Angeles, intersection of Main and Temple and Spring Street. Some of you may recognize this area. And within the red rectangle is where Tomas lived with the Johnson family. He lived there probably until 1859, when Carmen Johnson, James Johnson's widow, was forced to sell the home because the financial circumstances were declining. But this is where Tomas lived when the lone woman was in Santa Barbara in 1853. And she was only alive for 7 weeks, so obviously they didn't have time to find him. But this is the heart of downtown Los Angeles, the business district, as it was then. And of course, this is 1880s. This is not 1835, so it wouldn't have been quite this crowded. In fact, I love to point out, look at the parking. It's really at a premium already. You've got horses and carts. They're lining up there. So it's already a hot spot. Actually, the whole block before the red rectangle is now where the federal courts building is. And the block where Tomas lived with the Johnson family is where the city hall is, the 32-story city hall, Los Angeles. So that's right where the neighborhood where the Nicoleños grew up, or at least spent the first many years of their life in Los Angeles. The other thing that's really interesting about this photograph is it's taken from the viewpoint of the Bella Union Hotel, and this was where Isaac Williams lived. He had an adobe built here in 1835. It actually was taken over by Pio Pico and was the last headquarters of the Mexican government in Alta California. It later became Bella Union Hotel, the Charles Hotel, and went into decline after that. But this photograph shows you how close, actually, I'm giving it away right now, Maria Magdalena lived at this location with Isaac Williams. And I should go into that story right now because I'm getting ahead of myself. This is another example of fan research. We ended up looking at her neighbors in the burial record, and two of her neighbors really stood out: Gervasio Alipas and Maria del Rosario Villa. And there was a notation on Maria's record that said, ambos pasados por las armas al día antecedente. And I had never seen that before. My Spanish is really poor, but I was curious. So I did Google Translate. And can anybody tell me what that means? Anybody here know Spanish? Ambos pasados por las armas al día antecedente. In the back? Ambos pasados por las armas. Ambos pasados por las armas. And in the context, they're in a cemetery. They were put to death. Basically, they were executed. And the reason was they had murdered her husband, Rosario Villa's husband. These were two lovers, Gervasio Alipas and Maria del Rosario Villa. Only they lived together while she was married to Domingo Feliz. And they murdered Domingo Feliz because he had the nerve to have the alcalde force his wife to come back and join him. And they were leaving town. They were going to Rancho Los Feliz, and unfortunately, Gervasio came and used his lasso and roped poor Domingo off the horse. Domingo was on the ground. Gervasio stabbed him, and he was dead. And they dragged him off to a ravine and kind of partially buried him. And this is kind of a long-winded story, but it will get to the point. The citizens of the town found out about it very quickly. The empty horse without Domingo Feliz and his wife came back, and they realized that Domingo Feliz had been murdered. So they captured Gervasio Alipas and Rosario Villa. They put him in jail in shackles. They took her to Abel Stern's house and kept her under lock and key. But the citizens of the town were irate. There was so much violence. It was going unpunished. They knew that this was a capital case that would not come to sentence, and an execution would not take place because an appeal would automatically be made, and a judge in Mexico would have to hear the case. So this was the first vigilante committee action. About 50 citizens formed a party for the defense of public safety, and they sent messages to the city council saying, we want these prisoners. Are you going to release them to us or not? Or are you going to execute them as they should be executed? And the city council said, we have nothing to do with you. This is an illegal action. But the city council was powerless to do anything about it. So the people in this vigilante committee overpowered the guard, took Gervasio Alipas on the hill behind the LA Plaza Church, and they shot him 4:30 in the afternoon on April 7th. And a half hour later, at 5 o'clock, they also shot Rosario Villa, and they let her sit in the chair. They were a little nice to her. She was really scared, but they shot her. And then they took these two bodies and had them out for 2 hours in front of the jail so everybody could see them. And then they got to be buried. And this comes to the part which ties in with the Nicoleña, Maria Magdalena. She was baptized on April 9th. These two were buried on April 8th. And they were buried, and their ceremony was performed by Father Pedro Cabot. So he was summoned, as it turns out, read the report, the Vigilante Committee report by Victor Proudhon, was the president of the committee. There was a footnote that said, Isaac Williams sent a note to Father Pedro Cabot to ask him to come and baptize a sick woman who was living in his household. And there was a dual purpose. There really was a sick woman living in Isaac Williams' household. But they also wanted Father Pedro Cabot to come and administer the last rites to the condemned murderers. And Father Cabot didn't come until the 8th, so that was a day late. The execution had already taken place. But so he buried Gervasio Lipas and Rosario Villa on April 8th, and then the next day he baptized Maria Magdalena on April 9th. That was how we knew she was living with Isaac Williams. So fan research was very helpful there. It's kind of a long way around. Thank you for hanging in there with me. Took a while, but we got there. Okay, this is the handout that you all have, or some of you have. This is just to show you, and actually this is a partial view of the handout that you have. This is to show you, we did look at the native people from the southern islands of San Clemente. That's the left-hand column. And Santa Catalina, that's the next column over. And the undifferentiated island Indian, it was called either Isla or Isleño. And as you can see, a lot of them took place in the early to mid 1820s and 1830s. And most of the island Indians from San Clemente and Santa Catalina had come off of the island by 1820, but they continued to trickle in and get baptized either as adults or have their children baptized or even have some of their infants baptized. But right about 1835 was kind of a cutoff. All the people from San Clemente Island, Catalina Island had already been baptized if they were going to be baptized, and they'd had their children baptized. And then that was when we started to see the Nicoleños, Tomas, Maria Magdalena, Juana, Maria Aleja, and Maria Luciana being baptized. So that's how we figured out they had come off the boat in 1835, late 1835. But it was important to understand the context of what happened to the other Southern Island Indians. And this is when we finally get to see one of the Nicoleños, Tomas, in the household of his godparent. And actually, in this case, it was his godmother's mother, Carmen Johnson. She was now a widow. James Johnson had died in 1847, and she headed this pretty incredible household. And there are a couple things that are funny about this. Her age was 32 here. Well, she had also been listed as 32 in the 1844 Mexican census. And it wasn't just vanity. It truly wasn't. The problem was this was a newly minted American town. It had formerly been all Spanish speaking. There were very few English speakers. So the census enumerator was John Evertson from New York. He comes to Los Angeles. He can't speak Spanish very well. The Spanish-speaking people sure can't speak English very well, so they did the best they could. Anyway, her age stayed the same. Tomas in the 1844 Mexican census of Los Angeles was listed as 15. Here he's listed as 14. Well, guess what? The native people were not giving their ages directly to the census enumerator. It was the head of household. Carmen Johnson didn't know how old he was. She didn't care. She just, figured out what, or maybe looked at the census numbers from the previous census. Oh, he's 15. So, and the other thing on this one, there is both Tomas and Maria del Carmen are noted as Indian in this census. She is not one of the Nicoleño, we don't believe. She didn't show up as Nicoleño or Isla in 1835, 1836, or later. But there is a Maria del Carmen who was baptized in 1833 at Los Angeles Plaza Church, and she was from Quinqui, which means San Clemente Island. So we think she's another island Indian, but from San Clemente Island, ended up in the household of the Johnsons. But this is a real interesting household. Look how diverse it is. We've got Carmen Johnson, was born in Sonora, Mexico. 3 of her children were half European. Her husband, James Johnson, was from England. We've got one of her relatives, Jesus Guerrero. And down below, we've got William, who is a black man from Mexico, or from New York, sorry. And Jose Palayo, who was a laborer from Mexico. So we've got people from Mexico, people from New York, half Mexican, half European, and island Indians all living together in early Los Angeles, and hopefully getting along or learning how to. And from our fan research, from looking at friends, associates, and neighbors, particularly on census records, but certainly on baptismal records, we were able to figure out where all the Nicoleños, or probable Nicoleños, were living. Tomas, of course, was in the Johnson household. Juana was in the household of her godmother, Nieves Guerrero, who was Carmen Johnson's sister. Maria Aleja, as I mentioned, was living in the household, we believe, of her godmother, Maria Ignacia Amador. Maria Magdalena was not living with her godparents. She was living with Isaac Williams. And Maria Luciana, newborn, and her island Indian parents were likely living in an Indian locality called the Rancheria de los Pipimartes. The island Indians in Los Angeles apparently had their own cluster of families that lived together, and we, from various sets of documents, figured out that it was at San Pedro and between 7th and 8th Streets on the west side. And the reason why we figured out she may have lived there, her parents may have lived there, Maria Luciana's godmother was Encarnacion Reyes. Her father was Jose Jacinto Reyes, and he and his family were godparents to 10 island Indians. It's more than any other family in Los Angeles. And the reason why we feel that is true, or that is important, is because the Reyes family owned property on either side of San Pedro at 7th Street. So their property, their vineyards, actually bracketed the village of the island Indians. And Maria Luciana and her parents probably lived there and probably worked for the Reyes family. And this is Adelaida Johnson, of course, Tomas's godmother and daughter of Carmen Johnson, with her first husband, Francis Mellis, who was a very prominent American businessman in early Los Angeles. And this is a plan view map of the downtown section of Los Angeles from 1849 AOC Ords map, if anybody's familiar with this. The cross hatch in the middle is Ords compass rose, so north is pointing to the upper right. Number 1 is the Los Angeles Plaza Church. It's in that locality right now. And number 2 is the Plaza. Olvera Street is just to the right of number 2 of the Plaza. I'm sure many of you visited Olvera Street. But you can see number 3 was where the Johnson family lived. And Tomas lived in that locality probably from about 1835 through 1859 when the house was sold. Number 4 is where Isaac Williams lived. That was where his adobe was, and Maria Magdalena lived there. So they were not quite shouting distance, but pretty close. Number 5 was where the Rancheria de los Poblanos was. This is also locality of the Alvarado complex at 1st Street in Maine, and that's probably where Maria Aleja lived with Maria Ignacia Amador when she first came to town. The Rancheria de los Poblanos was kind of an encampment, not an Indian rancheria of any long standing, but that was probably where the Indians from Mayenga moved after the initial pueblo moved the plaza. The early, let me see if I can do this with the arrow. The earliest location of the Pueblo of Los Angeles was here. It eventually moved here, particularly after the massive flooding of 1815. So the Indians who lived in this area were forced to move south to a location that became known as the Rancheria de los Poblanos. And this is the larger view of AOC Ords' 1849 map. You can see Number 1 and number 2 were on the raised river terrace. That was where most of the townspeople lived. It was a much better place to live because it was above the floodplain. Everywhere else was in the floodplain. And this was an important site. This was where we believe where the Rancheria de los Pipimares was located. That was near the property of the Reyes family. And there was also a very interesting interview. We read Cesaria Valenzuela de Lorenzana gave an interview to Charles J. Prudhomme in 1913. She lived quite close to that area, and she described in 1842 a morning ceremony that was being performed by the Pipimares Indians. Apparently, it was a multi-day ceremony. They built a bonfire. They threw chia seeds, pinon nuts, and juniper berries on a fire, as well as clothing and other items belonging to deceased relatives. And then the ceremony was completed. But that was another reason why we started putting different pieces of direct and indirect evidence together that the village of the Island Indians was in this area of 7th Street and San Pedro. And actually, if we think about it, Maria Luciana and her parents could easily have been part of that ceremony in 1842. One thing I need to point out, and this was certainly important to understand, again, the context of life in early Los Angeles for the Nicoleños, the native people were literally marginalized in their own territory. They were first moved from Yanga, which was the original site, number 1 there. That was the site that the Portola expedition members encountered in 1769. They were moved south once the people of the Pueblo decided to move their town to more prime territory away from the flooding. Los Angeles River, by the way. Sorry, I should put this out. This is the Los Angeles River here. This is east. Los Angeles River also is up in this area north of town. That's why the water was flooding that early town site so badly. People also wanted to move the Island Indian village. Somebody had a dispute with them, and actually most of it was probably a naked land grab. They really wanted the territory for vineyards and other agricultural purposes. So everyone was moved to the rancherias. Number 4 there, the one on the right was likely in place early on, but then, and that lasted about 10 years, from 1836 to about 1845. Then everybody was moved to number 5, Pueblito. That was east of Los Angeles River. That site lasted about 5 years, and then that rancheria was raised. And the Indians, again, were forced to move in dispersed settlements or to live with their employers in town. So this was another reason why the Nicoleños likely lived with their godparents. They saw the continuous movement of the Indians who were living in that area, continuous forced movement, and it made more sense for the Nicoleños to live with godparents rather than try to make it on their own. In 1860, after Carmen Johnson sold the home, Tomas had to find another place to live. He ended up moving to work for Antonio Coronel. And Coronel was a very prominent member of the community. He was the first Latino mayor of Los Angeles, and he was also an assessor, and he was state treasurer for a while, but he owned a large vineyard on Alameda at the level of 7th Street. So Tomas shows up on his census enumeration, and he also shows up as recently married. So the next person on that same list is a young girl, woman, Refugio Lopez, who was an Indian. So we looked for the marriage record, and sure enough, we found the marriage record. And that was a gold mine because the witnesses on the marriage record told us that we had the correct Tomas. One of the witnesses was Soledad Coronel, that was Antonio Coronel's sister. The other witness was Maria de la Merced de Valdez, and that was Tomas's former next door neighbor on Spring Street. So that told us, yes, that this was the same Tomas. So this also showed us that he was alive in 1860. So he lived at least 7 years beyond when the lone woman was in Santa Barbara in 1853. And this is a timeline we're able to construct for 5 individuals. The vertical columns represent the records we'd identified for 5 different people. As you can see, we have the most records for young Tomas, 6 records in a row, and several others. We have records going through 1850s. So, we're pretty certain many of these individuals lived beyond the early 1850s. It's been hard to find the records. One of the things that helped us a lot initially was using the Early California Population Project database, which is published and online by the Huntington Library. Anybody can access it. It's got records of over 200,000 sacramental baptisms, marriages, or burials at the various Spanish missions and the Los Angeles Plaza Church. It runs only up to 1850, though. So we're back to looking through year after year after year for deaths of different Nicoleños, Juana and Maria Luciana. And it's difficult unless you've got extra information on those burial records. If you've got a burial record for just someone by the name of Juana, and no witness or notation where she was from, then you cannot identify it as Juana from San Nicolas Island. So it's tough going, but we're working on it. And actually, there was a birth. Tomas and his wife, Refugio Lopez, did have a son. And I have to give credit where credit is due. This was found by Ted Gostin, who's a professional genealogist who lives in Sherman Oaks. I had consulted with him. I asked him to look at my research plan to see if I'm making all the right choices, looking in all the right archives. And he went over my research plan, but he couldn't resist himself, and he opened up his computer and looked at his database. And within a matter of minutes, it was almost embarrassing. No, it was wonderful. I was just amazed. It was great. He found these 2 records. And what I realized is I had to check my assumption. I had been looking for records for Indian neophytes. And this little boy was not indicated to be an Indian, and neither were his parents. So I had seen 6 records in a row for Tomas from San Nicolas Island as an Indian. And all of a sudden, and this is the same priest, Blas Rajo. Father Rajo did not indicate that Tomas was an Indian, although he did when he married Tomas and Refugio. Anyway, little Esteban de los Reyes Ares was born in 1861. And unfortunately, the little guy passed away, less than 10 months later. But what's intriguing about this is that he had a last name which was similar to Tomas's native name. Tomas on his marriage record used what appeared to be a surname, Agri. And we looked at that upside down and sideways, and it didn't look like a Spanish name at all. And finally, we figured out it's likely his native name. But what happened with little Esteban's baptismal record, that name had started to change, to become Hispanicized. So from Agri, it became Ares. And then in the burial record, it was noted as Agres. So we're seeing name change pretty rapidly from 1860, 1861, and 1863, which is real intriguing. And this was it's not quite a family tree chart in the traditional sense, but this is the closest thing that I could cobble up. Juana Maria was the name that the lone woman of San Nicolas Island was given upon her baptism on October 19th, 1853. And Black Hawk, of course, was not his native name. It was a name given to him by sailors. We've got approximate dates here where I wasn't certain. I put ABT for about, and for the death dates, I put AFT if I had a record and I wanted to indicate after this date. So this shows you at least Tomas, Agri, and Refugio Lopez had a son, Esteban de los Reyes Agres. And the second tier represents the probable, or two are highly likely to be Nicoleños, Juana and Maria Aleja, We're not so certain about the Indian father and island Indian mother of Maria Luciana, but given the timing of her baptism, it's certainly plausible. So as you can see, we've got a good start, and we're still working on it. The research continues. And this is a summary of what we've looked at and discovered to date. We've identified 2 Nicoleños, 2 probable Nicoleñas, 2 possible Nicoleñas and their daughter. We found the people who the Nicoleños lived with and the locations where they lived in Los Angeles, the status and occupation of at least Tomas and Juana. Both were listed as, she was listed as a servant in 1836. He was listed as a servant and she was in 1844. And Tomas was listed as a laborer, farm laborer in 1860. The location of the Rancheria de los Pipimares and the Rancheria de los Poblanos, they had been mentioned before, but had not been pinpointed in any records, any published records, any scholarly records, I should say. There is one newspaper account in 1894, Los Angeles Herald, that helped to confirm the location of the Rancheria de los Pipimares at San Pedro and between 7th and 8th Streets. And of course, we now know that Tomas, at least, was alive when the lone woman was in Santa Barbara, but she died too soon for them to be able to locate him. And she was not the last of her people. They had not all died out. This is, of course, a contemporary photograph of Los Angeles Plaza Church. This is where Tomas, Juana, Maria Aleja, Maria Luciana, and Esteban were baptized. And this is also where Maria Magdalena was buried. She was likely buried to the left of the church. There was a south side cemetery. It's now a memorial garden. And any of you can go and visit, pay your respects to Maria Magdalena and all the Indians, all the island Indians, all the native peoples who came to Los Angeles to help to build the city. And I'd like to leave you with these names of the native people from the Los Angeles Plaza Church records. These are all island Indians from San Clemente Island and Catalina Island, as well as just the one from San Nicolas Island. Not all native names were recorded by the Spanish padres, but at least we have these names. We know the native people lost their land, they lost their lifeway, their names were taken and replaced by Spanish names, but at least we can remember them and acknowledge that descendants of more than 160 island Indians baptized in Los Angeles are still with us today. Thank you very much.
Now we have time for a quick question and answer period. So we can take a few questions. So we can begin that now.
What does the name Peor de Nada mean?
The schooner Peoris Nada, it literally means better than nothing. It was kind of like they put the ship together with duct tape, and it really wasn't that well built, but it got out to the island and got back.
Is there a relationship between the Nicoleños and the Chumash?
Well, yes, they both lived on the Southern California coast, but they had different languages. They had some similar customs. Both had plank canoes, but they were different linguistically and in other ways. And of course, the Chumash were living on the northern Channel Islands, San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, whereas the Nicoleño and the island Gabrielino were living on Catalina, San Clemente, and San Nicolas.
Just peor es nada means worse is nothing. Worse. Like it's the worst. Worst is nothing. Yeah.
We have time for one final question.
Yeah, you in your research you referred to the godparents over and over, and at that time, and in the structure of the family and in the households, what was the role and the importance of godparents and and you know, and as far as them being called godparents?
Okay, godparents, from what I understand, were to stand in for parents in case the parents were to pass. Godparents were to take care of their godchild, educate them, give them advice. We don't know what the exact relationship was between the Nicoleño Indians and the gente de raison, the Mexican or American or European godparents. But it was supposed to be respectful and beneficial, particularly for the child. Uh, not ostensibly exploitative, but it could have been that way. We just don't know in this case.
All right. Well, we would like to thank Susan Morris for today's lecture.